gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Judson Brewer. Jud Brewer is a thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery. He's a psychiatrist, an MD, a PhD, a founder of Mind Sciences. He's the director of research and innovation for the Mindfulness Center. He's done research and teaching at Brown, MIT, Yale, UMass, and he's the author of the book, The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits. He's been featured on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper, which was super fun. That's on his website. His TED Med Talk from 2015. Now I looked on TED.com, has like 12 million views, which is super great to see. It's one of the breakout talks from TED Med that year, and now it's on TED.com. So, Jud, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad that you're here. It's really fun to reconnect with you. You know, after you did that talk at my last TEDx, the TEDx Rock Creek Park, my buddy Nassim Asefi, who was the curator of TED Met at the time, saw of all the, I think we had 27 speakers. She saw all the speakers and said, Jud's the one I'm going to follow up with. So I so appreciate what you did for that TEDx. And I'm so glad that it went on to create that breakout talk for you on TED Med.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It was really fun.
Yeah, Nassim's amazing. So so I'd love to hear, you know, I always love to hear from our guests, like how they come to this work. And you know, for you, I was like, gee, I wonder, you know, given all you've done and your many, you know, accomplishments and educations, I'm like, did you come to neuroscience first, or meditation first, or some, you know, study of the mind first? Like what, like tell us a little bit about the kind of what came first and how it all unfolded for you.
Yeah, you know, I was a bit of a stressed out college senior, and started when I was starting medical school. I'd even gone through a bad relationship breakup and was having trouble sleeping at the beginning of, right before I started medical school. So, you know, it was a new beginning in my life. And so I figured, you know, let me try something new. And literally on my first day of medical school, I started meditating. So I think, you know, that question about studying the mind, it wasn't even a question for me because I didn't even know the question to ask. It was one of those unknown unknowns. You know, it's like I was so identified with it. And I can say retrospectively, now that I know that I didn't know, and I know a little bit more about my own mind, that those two kind of came along together, where when I started meditating, it helped me start to understand how my mind worked. And then I had this realization, oh, I could actually work with my mind. And I shifted my entire career from molecular biology to studying, you know, becoming an addiction psychiatrist, studying neuroscience, learning neuroimaging, doing clinical trials. It was a huge shift for me, but I was so fascinated. And I was also so inspired by how some of the ancient techniques that I'd been learning could be applied in modern day in places where we're really struggling with like addiction treatment, that I really wanted to, you know, dedicate my life to doing this. In fact, I was in residency training at Yale, and somebody said to me, "You're going to kill your career doing this," literally. And I said, well, I'd rather fail doing something that I'm really passionate about than succeed, you know, continuing to do what I'm doing, or what I'd done previously. And you know, back then, nobody knew even the word mindfulness. You know, it was really not, there were no clinical, very, very few scientific studies. And, you know, I think the guy said it legitimately. And, you know, who knew that this whole field was going to really blossom like it has.
Yeah. Well, so when, you know, your colleague said you're going to kill your career doing this, what was this that you were doing at the time?
I'd studied molecular biology, we looked at these interactions between like stress and the immune system. And I could, I'd learned how to knock out mice and genes, ask good questions. We published a bunch of good papers that were highly cited and all that stuff. So he was saying, well, why don't you continue being a molecular biologist and learn these pathways? And, I was thinking, well, it's really important to understand mechanistically how things work. Yet I realized we could actually apply this to behavioral treatments as well. And that was something I don't think had been done, and still isn't being done that much, where we're really trying to clearly identify pathways to target. If you think of cancer treatments, back in the 50s, we had things like vincristine and these other chemotherapeutics that were really toxic, because, it's like kill everything and hope the person doesn't die. And now they've got specific pathways that they can target and get very good results, very high remission rates with very few side effects. And I think we owe it to ourselves to take the same approach with behavioral treatments as well.
Yeah. So what caused you to focus on habits or addiction? Yeah.
I grew up kind of poor, and there was something about when I started seeing patients with addictions who really, they were shunned from society. They were very self-judgmental, and there was something I could actually relate to them a lot. And I really wanted to help there. And there also weren't very many good treatments for addictions. And lo and behold, it turns out that I was addicted to tons of things. I mean, not the classical addictions like cocaine or heroin, but as I started to go through this process of learning, I realized I was addicted to everything from distraction to thinking to romantic love to whatever, just to the point where I could write a whole book about this. It's like first half of my book is, the titles of the chapters are like addicted to thinking, addicted to distraction, addicted to love, because I could bring in some of my own personal experience and then also the research that my lab has done to bring those together. But it really points out this universality of this addictive process. And that got me really fascinated with not just addictions, but breaking it down into habits. Like, why do we form habits in the first place? And can we actually help people change habits? Because we're not doing a great job right now as a society. We've got an opioid epidemic. We've got an obesity epidemic, in clinicians and physicians. We have a burnout epidemic. That's like epidemics of all sorts of things. Where's the treatment? What are we doing? And why aren't we doing better?
Yeah. So all the epidemics, at least that I heard you name, are epidemics of habit or addiction. So I'm curious, how do we get so addicted? Why do we stay so stuck?
Yeah. The story gets so fascinating. So it turns out that there's this very basic learning pathway that's set up to help us survive. And we need to, so there are a couple of things we need. We need food, we need to procreate, and we need to avoid danger. And actually, if you want to show this, I think I sent along a slide that I can just walk people through this.
Yeah, let's look at it.
This process has been very, very well described from a psychological and a psychiatric perspective. Back in the 1800s, there's this guy, Ed Thorndike, who started studying animal behavior. B.F. Skinner, many of you may know his name. He became famous for this pathway that's described, and you can see here as operant conditioning or reinforcement learning. And basically, if we see something that looks good, our brain says, eat that. We have this craving, and so we eat it, or we, smoke if we're, well, let's start with eating. And then we lay down this memory that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So that was set up to help us survive. You see food, you eat the food, and this dopamine signal goes to your brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. In modern day, we all have a refrigerator, or at least, most of us, and we can, we don't need to remember where food is, right? We don't have to go foraging for it. And we also don't have to, in most societies that are relatively safe, we don't have to worry about where the danger is. but these processes are still at play. So our brains start doing things like learning to eat when we're stressed or anxious, or we learn to smoke to relieve stress or whatnot. So you can see this operant conditioning pathway is still at play in modern day, even though it's literally killing us. Smoking, #1 preventable cause of morbidity and mortality in the US. And so I'll just finish with this slide. These blue pieces actually show where we bring in current treatments. So again, mechanistically, if we can understand how something's happening, we can then use that mechanistic pathway to try to target things. So for example, my patients with alcohol use disorder, if they're, there's this saying, people, places, and things. If they avoid people, places, and things, avoid those cues, they're less likely to drink. My patients say, duh, I get it. With smoking, for example, it's a little harder to avoid all the different places that we smoke. So we bring in treatments like substitution behaviors, like eat candy instead of smoking. And you can see how that, kind of treats around the behavior that we're targeting. The problem with both of these is you can see with these orange arrows that neither of them actually dismantle this core addictive loop, which may be why, just as an example, smoking, if somebody quits smoking today, the likelihood that they're going to stay quit in a year is about 5%. So, the treatments aren't at the level that I think most of us would like to see. So that's the basic process. It was set up to help us survive, and it's actually set up so that we can kind of free up brain space to do other things. You set a habit of, getting up in the morning, remembering how to walk, remembering how to eat, remembering how to talk. Because if we had to relearn everything, we'd be exhausted by breakfast. So it can be helpful in a way of helping us survive. But if these things get out of hand, which is what we see a lot with habit formation of these addictive habits, then it becomes problematic.
I'm looking at this through the lens of mindfulness, probably because we brought it up, we talked about it, and because, as I'm going through this meditation mindfulness meditation teacher training, of which you're on the faculty, which is awesome. But now I'm looking at this through this lens, and when I look at the blue arrows, it's like deny, resist, deny, resist, deny, resist.
Yeah.
So now I'm looking through this like a whole new lens, as to why these typical approaches don't work, because they're about denial and kind of resistance. Yeah. Anyway, that just came up for me for the first time ever.
Oh, so what was it? The Borg on Star Trek, where they say resistance is futile. The Borg actually knew what time it was, because we could interpret that in modern psychological terms as willpower does not work. Good luck if you're going to stick with willpower, because it's futile. And there's a lot of work now suggesting, it's like I learned in medical school. If you want to lose weight, there's this formula. Just make sure you have more calories out than in. So instead of eating cake, eat salad. The formula is correct, yet an academic definition of how to lose weight is not what actually happens in the clinics. My patients come in and say, I get it, I just can't do it, because we don't wander into the kitchen early in the morning looking for ice cream. We come in late at night when we're stressed, when we're lonely, when we're tired, and all these things where our willpower is at its weakest. And in fact, there's good research now showing that the weakest part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, is the part that's involved in willpower. And so it's kind of doomed from the beginning. It's this, we're relying on the weakest link to help us at the hardest times of day. Forget about it. No wonder the quit rates are 5%. No wonder there's this thing called yo-yo dieting, where people, they get on a roll and lose 10 pounds and then suddenly gain it back. Like the majority of people on a diet gain back their weight and potentially more. That's why it's called yo-yo dieting. Then they try it again, and all this stuff. So that resistance piece is exhausting and doesn't actually work.
It's a lot of things are occurring to me for the first time in this conversation. One is like this idea. So do you buy into the idea that we have a bucket of willpower in the morning and we eat away at that bucket all day long? And it's, you know, like, do you buy into that we have so much and then we kind of use it up?
It's a controversial topic, and there's been a lot of research on it. There's a guy, Roy Baumeister at Florida State, that studied this. And so their research suggests that that's the case, that we become depleted throughout the day. It's controversial. Not all people agree with that hypothesis. Experientially, I see a lot of my patients coming into my clinic saying just that. So there is some face validity to it. And so I would say for the purposes of experimentation, we see this happen all the time. I see this with my patients.
Yeah. And I experience it too. And I can't come up with a language for this, but it occurs to me like there's the willpower that says, I won't do this, I won't do this, I won't do this. Like, right. And it gets emptier and emptier throughout the day. And then I think like there's this other thing that's happening through us through the day, which is like our energy, like maybe we're being energetically depleted and emotionally depleted, like throughout the day. And our deepest level of energetic and emotional depletion occurs when our willpower is the lowest.
Yeah, I think that's true. And what do we do when we're depleted? We go back to our old habits because our brain says, I'm just too tired to think any new thought or to try to see if this new environment is safe. I'm just going to go to what I know.
Yeah. So does what we talked about address why willpower isn't enough, or is there more around why like just willpower is enough to break a habit?
I think that's probably enough for, I tend to be pretty pragmatic, as a clinician. I'm thinking, what are the essential elements that we need to know? And the bottom line is, we kind of have an understanding of what the brain regions are that are involved in willpower, why it fails, because those are the weak brain regions. And so I think that's probably enough from a pragmatic standpoint. I guess we could get into a little bit around what the quality of our experience is around willpower. You talked about resistance, because that might help set up some ways that we can actually step out of these habit loops in a different way.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So describe for me what you said resistance.
Yeah.
What does that feel like for you experientially?
Yes. Let me think. Okay, so I'm trying to put those two ideas to work for me. So the avoidance would be like, don't go into the kitchen after 7 or whatever it is, right? But resistance would be like for instance, if my husband comes downstairs with a bowl of ice cream and says, do you want some? And like, it's energetically depleting. Like I'm resisting resisting the temptation.
Yeah.
That's what I'm resisting.
Yeah. It takes a lot of work.
It takes a lot of work.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I'm hearing. So let me ask you one other piece to this. If you were to describe, if you had to put it into one bucket or another, from a direct experiential standpoint, does resistance and does avoidance, do those feel more closed down or more opened up?
Oh, it's definitely more closed down.
Okay.
And in fact, I'll take it one step further. Husband comes downstairs, bowl of ice cream. Do you want some? And I'll like, no, but like, I'll go eat an apple. I would never have eaten that apple otherwise, or I would never, like, whatever it is, or I'll get like, I would never have eaten that otherwise. So it's like that substitution behavior that's maybe the result of the resistance.
Yeah, even when you're not hungry.
Like, I don't want a reward. And it's kind of like, reward? Like, yeah, do I want a reward? Of course I do.
Yeah, that's how our brains are built. Reward, reward, reward.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No. So no, go ahead. Because I think that what's next is, what do we do about all this?
Yeah. So reward is actually what drives future behavior. So this reward-based learning pathway is based, we perpetuate behaviors based on rewards, not on the behaviors themselves. So if we wanted to change a behavior and it was just about the behavior that drove future behavior, we just stop doing it and say, okay, just stop eating that third cupcake or that second bowl of ice cream. But it's actually the reward that comes from it that drives future behavior that says, oh, that was good, do it again. So this is where it gets really interesting, where we can actually tap into the system itself. And so we started looking at this from a mechanistic standpoint and saying, okay, willpower, not doing it for us. And willpower is more based on the behavior piece. Just don't do the behavior. But that's not actually mechanistically, it doesn't get at the mechanism of how our brains learn. So ideally, if that's the strongest part of our brain, the strongest learning mechanism, why not tap into that? Mm-hmm. So that's where we started looking at mindfulness training. And mindfulness, in a nutshell, is about helping us become very aware of our actions and very aware of that coupling between action and outcome, right? Behavior or cause and effect. So if we eat the ice cream, what's the effect of eating the ice cream? And food, well, let's use something simpler than food. Let's use smoking, for example. If we smoke a cigarette and we're not paying attention, we're just going to continue smoking it habitually. We smoke a cigarette and we pay attention. And I see this with my patients all the time. We do this. We have this digital therapeutic, an app-based mindfulness training for smoking called Craving to Quit. And the first thing it has them do is pay attention while they're smoking a cigarette. And they come to this thing, I had a guy come in, he was smoking, I think 40 cigarettes a day. And so I think he had reinforced that pathway about 293,000 times. We calculated this out. So he'd really grooved that a lot. And I said, well, let's pay attention. And the app walks him through, like, what's it feel like when you inhale and all this, what's it smell like, what's it taste like? He's like, I never realized how terrible this is. I've been doing this for 40 years. And so what that does is help our brain get accurate and updated information about how rewarding something is. And with smoking in particular, it's not that rewarding. Vaping's a different story. They understand this. And so they're like, okay, what are all the things that are nasty about smoking? Let's get rid of them. Let's make it mango flavored. Let's make it into some cool, hip looking thing where, whatever. So they know the mechanism and they're using it for various purposes. But with smoking, we can just see this as a proof of concept, how this works. And so we have people pay attention as they smoke. And their brain starts to get accurate and updated information, so that reward value starts to drop. And they're less excited to smoke in the future. There's no willpower involved in becoming disenchanted with something. You're just like, why would I do that? It tastes like crap. And in our first clinical study, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment with mindfulness, helping people pay attention, but also giving them tools to work with so that they could write out their cravings. And it actually feels pretty good when you can notice, the sensations that come up when you have a craving and realize that these are just sensations. They aren't some moral imperative that you have to act on. And so we can not only help people see that there's a lack of reward in the old behavior, but there's actually something that feels better. I think of this as the bigger, better offer. We give our brain the bigger, better offer. And with mindfulness, it's the bigger, better offer comes in the flavor of curiosity, kindness, connection. You can think of those things where, instead of that contracted quality that comes with a craving, we can actually get curious. Oh, what's this craving feel like? And in that moment, it flips the valence from unpleasant, like contracted quality to more open curiosity that feels good in itself. I even had somebody so we've gone on to make, app-based trainings for eating called Eat Right Now, one for anxiety called Unwinding Anxiety. It's amazing with this Unwinding Anxiety app, we had somebody report that she had replaced her old feelings of panic and worry with curiosity. So when panic comes up, her automatic response was, that's interesting. Wow. And she said something like, it really takes the wind right out of its sails because, it just feels better to be curious right in the moment when we're having a craving or we're having a panic attack. And so it was a great example of how she could actually hack that same habit loop to replace the old behavior of worry with the new behavior of curiosity that is always available for her. It's not like she has to go to the store to buy curiosity. You know, it's just a matter of fostering it.
Well, that's super cool. So we've got some questions I'd love to get to, both from our audience before and pre-asked questions. So Shannon is asking the question, how do habit pathways in the brain versus research on gene expression in the amygdala that contribute to addictive behaviors intersect?
Wow, that could be a whole hour-long lecture. So I'll say briefly, one, I think that the amygdala is somewhat of a misunderstood part of the brain. You know, a lot of people have kind of popularized it as like, this is the fear organ. It's actually a little more nuanced than that, where it helps us pay attention to see if something is dangerous or not. And so with the addiction pathways, one thing that is common in how genes can contribute to this is that every known drug of abuse leads to dopamine release in a brain region called the nucleus accumbens. And that's part of this reward-based learning system where, you know, it says, oh, remember what you just did, do that again. Dopamine's actually about helping us learn. And then as we've learned something, it motivates us to do that behavior again. So when we've learned something, then we have a thought or we see a trigger of something like, oh, ice cream, we have a thought of ice cream. That dopamine says, you know, it makes us restless and motivated to get out of the chair and go to the kitchen to get the ice cream. And there are a number of genes that contribute to, you know, whether we're more susceptible or release more dopamine or have, you know, different receptor levels for the dopamine in our system, where some folks, you know, are even more susceptible to those things than others.
Great, makes sense. Jody asked the question, how does moving into alpha brain state help change with process, help to change habits?
Alpha, I'm assuming that she's talking about EEG alpha waves, I'm guessing. I would like to say that we know something about that, but alpha is a pretty broad, you know, like it depends on where in the brain it is. And there's EEG, even though it's been known for a long time, there's not a whole lot that's actually been clearly described around, say, like general alpha rhythms and addiction and habit change than I'd like to see. So it's something certainly my lab's been studying, you know, but we look more at specific brain regions where we can actually use EEG neurofeedback. This is the thing that Anderson Cooper came in and played with.
Yeah, that's cool.
So there are specific brain regions we can target and look at brain signals in certain EEG activity that correlate with kind of, you know, that closed state of getting caught up in a craving or getting caught up in anxiety. And then the open state that comes with bringing awareness to whatever our situation is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Janet Emmett is asking the question about the habit of procrastination and,
Yeah.
and how this works around like the habit of procrastination.
Yeah, it's a great question. I could make a bad joke about, we'll get to that one later. So you can think of a trigger being, oh, I have to get this report done, or I have to do something. And the procrastination comes in where it probably doesn't feel very good. So that triggers us to procrastinate. So that's the behavior. And then the result of that is that we get a brief relief or a temporary remiss from, you know, that unpleasant feeling of having to do something.
So that's the reward.
Yeah. And actually, you can, if you briefly bring up one of the simplification slide, what I'm talking about is we can actually distill a lot of what we talked about with reinforcement learning to 3 things, which is a trigger, a behavior, and a reward or a result. So typically the trigger is something that is, you know, doesn't feel good. So for example, procrastination fits right into this where, oh, I have to do this. I have to write this paper. Actually, if you go back one slide, I think this is
there it is.
There it is. Yeah. So then we do things like we binge, we worry, we look at cute pictures of puppies on Instagram as a way to procrastinate. And then we get this temporary relief that comes with distraction or whatever the brief reward is. So that's probably enough of that slide to give folks a sense for the simplification of the process. And you can probably just close these for now. We'll come back to, well, actually, I'm going to show this here. So what we were talking about earlier is that we can actually replace these old habits with the new behavior of curious awareness, which is something that's already and always available to us. And what that does is give us access to something that we think of as sustained relief, because there's less force involved. Curiosity is always available, and it feels better than both the craving and satisfying the craving itself, because often satisfying the craving leads to us wanting more and more and more and more. Especially sugar is a great one, where sugar just says, oh, time to eat more. I remember somebody brought some homemade chocolate chip cookies to my house not too long ago. And as soon as I'd finished one, my brain said, gotta eat another one, gotta eat another one. And that's really different for me than eating, say, dark chocolate. Like 85% dark chocolate has a satisfaction quality to it where I don't actually have to eat very much of it. So that's kind of, this is a summary slide of where mindfulness comes in.
Cool. So we're getting some questions about the prefrontal, some people kind of say the prefrontal cortex is the weakest. Like why are we saying that, and how else can that be described? And how do we think, why is that, and how do we think about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So from an evolutionary perspective, there are these, the brain stem and these old systems. I think of them as old systems, the ones that are involved in just really critical functions like breathing, heart rate, temperature regulation, all that stuff. And so we think of some describe these as like the reptilian brain, or, kind of the older brains. And then on top of that, we've kind of layered on, it's kind of like an onion, you layer on newer and newer and newer parts of the brain. So the newest part of the brain, called the neocortex, is the part that's on the outermost part. And actually the prefrontal cortex is the part that seems somewhat, most evolved. So it's not seen in lower animals. And that's the part that's involved in thinking, planning, willpower, and things like that.
Okay, great. So Chris, I've taken all the questions out of the Q&A. What's going on in the chat that Jud and I should respond to?
We have a whole lot going on in the chat. This is quite the topic, and it's spurring a lot of questions and reactions and experiences. One question that's come up is from Janet, and she says, how do you stop the gotta eat another one and then shift to mindfulness? How do you make that shift in the middle of when you're already in the action you don't necessarily want to continue? What practice is there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in our Eat Right Now app, we actually teach people something which can seem heretical to the traditional diet programs, which is go ahead and eat it. We say don't stop, because this isn't about willpower. It doesn't work. If it worked, then you'd stop. So we actually say go ahead and eat it, but just like I described with the person smoking a cigarette, we say really pay attention to the cause and effect, quality of the experience. So what's it like when you eat the first cookie? What's it like when you eat the second cookie? What's it like when you eat the third one? Is there a difference in quality of the experience? Is it less rewarding? Does it become less rewarding? And then are there other things that come in? Like does our stomach feel bloated? Do we feel guilty? Do all these other things come in that we can really pay attention to and start to see how unrewarding that quality of behavior is? And we think of this as, I like this, one of the exercises we have people do is ask this question, how little is enough? As in, really pay attention as you're eating, like, is this enough? Is this enough? Is this enough? So they can really pay attention to the rewarding quality of the experience. I have a friend, Dana Small, who's a food researcher at Yale, and she actually, for her PhD thesis, fed people chocolate in a PET scanner where she could scan their brains as she was basically doing that experiment. And what they reported over time was loved it, liked it, it was okay, not so good, I hate this, get me out of here, same chocolate. But over time, the reward value just drops because they've had enough and then they've had too much. Interestingly, there's a part of their brain that's part of this default mode network that mindfulness actually targets, that was activated at both ends of the spectrum, when they really wanted more and they really wanted less. So the idea here is these brain regions get caught up when we're, get activated when we get caught up in any extreme. I want more, I want less, right? I want to make this go away. I want. Mindfulness is really about stepping back from that and welcoming whatever our experience is, even if it's a craving, so that we can be really curious about what's happening. And in particular, if we're going to eat the cookie, really bringing awareness to that. So in that moment, we can bow to it as a learning opportunity and say, what can I learn from this? How can I learn how my mind works? And how can I learn about what the actual reward value is of this experience right now, so that I can, in the future, I can recall that and be like, do I really want to do that? Not on a thinking level, but on a direct experiential level, where our body is kind of telling us, because our bodies are much wiser than our minds. Our minds are, the body's what drives future behavior. And that goes back to that old brain stuff that I was talking about.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. What else?
We have a lot of other choices, comments, and questions to choose from. One is from Shannon, and she says, you could work so hard on changing habits, but can those get overwritten by what is going on at a molecular level?
Yes, I think this comes back to the willpower piece. When we try really, really hard, that doesn't tend to stick because it's not rewarding for our brains. So at a molecular level, our brains are looking for what's the biggest reward that I can possibly get right now. And if our, willpower is not very rewarding, the result, if we've resisted something, might be a little rewarding, but we can actually tap into that reward in different ways, as we've been talking about. So at a molecular level, where the willpower piece, for example, is absolutely getting overwritten.
Very good. We have an insightful quote or comment from Tim as well. He says, mindfulness is the definite antidote to unconscious perception. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I like that, because I think we often, these habit loops get formed, and we start wearing a pair of glasses that we think of as subjective bias glasses, where we don't even know that we're wearing the glasses because we've been wearing them so long. It's kind of like, we're walking around, whatever our habit we've learned, whether it's maybe it's the ice cream habit, so we're walking around the world, on the lookout for ice cream, especially if we're sad, that radar goes up and it says, I need some ice cream. And so that's this unconscious piece that's like, that's telling us, find that ice cream. And mindfulness, as was it Tim it said, is it helps us kind of take those bias glasses off so we can actually see clearly.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. I think we'll continue on here. So let's go through the demonstration, if you're up for that. Okay. So I have to tell you. So when we talked, I don't know, it was a few weeks ago, and we said, okay, let's do a demonstration. And I'm like, I don't know, like I don't have any really bad habits. Like I can't, like I worked really hard to have good habits and bad habits. And then you suggested chocolate, and I'm like, oh, damn it. And so I've had just in thinking about the idea of us having this conversation about chocolate, I have been like recognizing how addicted I am to my addiction, how habituated I am to my habit. Like, even though I kind of maybe intellectually know that, if I didn't eat chocolate, maybe there'd be, although I eat the dark chocolate too, it's like, maybe I'd be healthier, maybe I wouldn't have those calories, right? But like, no, I'm like, no, I want that. No, I mean, don't make me not have that. It's like an addiction. I'm addicted to my addiction. So I don't know. So anyway, I just wanted to out myself with that.
Well, I like that you bring up chocolate, because it's it's nuanced, and I think life is nuanced, and so this is real life. So what we can do is explore, you can explore the full spectrum of chocolate. So for example, with milk chocolate, there's enough sugar in there that it can drive us to just be like, keep eating, keep eating. And we can explore what's it like to eat, a bar of milk chocolate versus, and paying attention, you eat the milk chocolate and see how much is enough versus eating the dark chocolate. For me, the milk chocolate just keeps driving it. Whereas the dark chocolate, it's actually just a couple of squares, especially really good, like 85% dark chocolate. It's really satisfying, but doesn't drive the process in the same way that the milk chocolate, which has more sugar in it, does. And so what's your experience when you've eaten milk versus dark chocolate?
Well, so I tend not to eat milk chocolate just because I don't honestly prefer it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll tell you though, I mean, just what I've been curious about, I mean, this has just caused me to be curious about my habit and my kind of mentalizing around my habit, which is the mentalizing around my habit is I have worked my ass off all day long, and I've been helping other people, trying to do good in the world, and like it's a little bit like, by God, I'm gonna have me some chocolate, right?
Yeah.
And I feel some real like deservitude, and a rigidity around it.
Yeah.
Now the like some of that, like when I reflect on it, it's not doesn't feel very good to talk about. And here's the other thing I'll share is like, so I don't eat a lot of chocolate. It's a couple of squares, but since you and I have talked about this, like I'm more noticing while I'm eating the chocolate, and this is what's happened, is my body stops wanting the chocolate more quickly, but my mind is going, oh man, I wanted some chocolate. So anyway, so that's my experience.
So I'm so glad you're able to see that nuance between the body and the mind, and the mind saying, oh man, I want more. We can separate out the piece where, like, it's not to say we shouldn't eat chocolate. Like, chocolate can be very rewarding, but in a sense, if there's deservitude, if we're going to treat ourselves, who treats themselves by, punching themselves in the face or cutting off their hand or doing something, that's not rewarding. Yet in fact, a lot of times, when somebody sits down to, and indulges, it's not, they're actually harming themselves. Mm-hmm. When we don't pay attention to that aspect of things, we're like, oh yeah, I'm treating myself. Well, how are you treating yourself by eating a full pint or, of ice cream, or, eating a whole chocolate bar? If we actually pay attention, that's not treating ourselves at all. That's not rewarding. And so if we pay attention, like you're talking about, you can get the rewarding aspects of a treat, like eating some dark chocolate. But there's this residual where it's just the mind that says, go, 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 that's habit. It's kind of like saying, well, you're supposed to eat more, you're supposed to eat more. But when you step back, you say, well, that's not actually the reward. I've got my reward. Then that helps our brain quiet down and be like, oh yeah, sorry, I just was stuck with the on button.
Yeah.
And then it's much more rewarding when we've actually, it moves us from self-indulgence to true self-care. Like the reward is self-care. The overeating or overdoing it is indulgence. And that's actually just habit playing itself out. That's not actually caring for ourselves at all.
Yeah. So if I were a client with a behavior that was derailing me, mm-hmm. How would you work with me? How would you work with me to change that behavior?
It's a great question. I would start by, and I actually was just in clinic yesterday doing this with somebody, I would start by helping, you know, as I tried to understand what your story was, like what was going on for you, I would just literally map out what the habit loop was. So I just did this with somebody that I saw for the first time yesterday, who came in with, he was binging and purging. So he had gained a bunch of weight from alcoholism, and he looked on the internet, and the internet said the fastest way to lose weight is purging, which is terrible. I don't know. Yeah, careful on the internet, folks. And so he started purging, and he lost a bunch of weight. And so the trigger would be, you know, thinking about his weight, and then the behavior would be purging after he ate food, and then the temporary reward was that he was losing some weight. So we just mapped this out and helped him really understand what was actually happening in his experience. That was the first step. And then the next step is to really see how rewarding it is. And he's like, yeah, it's not rewarding at all. It does not feel good. And so there, whether it's, you know, that's an extreme example, somebody in my psychiatric clinic, but this can happen for any of us, whether it's, you know, binging on news, on social media, on Netflix, on whatever. Is the first step is just to map this piece out. And then the second step is to really ask ourselves, how rewarding is this from an experiential standpoint? And I use the simple question, what am I getting from this? Not in a thinking way, but directly experientially. Like, what does it feel like? What does it feel like if I'm eating? What does it feel like in my stomach? If I'm, you know, binging on Netflix or scrolling through social media, how's my mind feel? You know, am I foggy? Am I kind of zoned out? And, you know, really seeing that cause and effect relationship, and then train people to become aware and bring in mindfulness practices. And that, you know, so it's a 3-step process. It's relatively simple, not easy to do, which is why we've developed these step-by-step, you know, app-based training programs to help people, you know, 10 minutes a day walk through this and apply it into their own lives. But that's the basic process is, you know, short moments, okay, map it out, see how rewarding it is, bring in mindfulness practice, repeat, repeat, repeat.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I can see based on what you've said that when I've got a bad habit, which taken to an extreme, actually, and when I bring awareness to it, it doesn't feel good. And I can kind of see how that could work. What about the creation of a good habit?
Yeah. So how would you define good habits?
Well, like for instance, someone who, you know, really says that they want to exercise, and that doesn't become something they actually do. Yeah.
Yeah. So here I would say the same principles apply, is really paying attention to what it's like when we're moving. So generally, you know, what's it feel like when we sit on the couch all day versus even just going for a walk around the block? You know, for me, it feels good to get up and move. And for most of us, you know, unless we're injured or have, you know, have some other issue, our bodies want to be in motion. They want to move at least sometime. And so we can just start at those very simple levels, is looking to see, well, what's it like when I don't exercise versus what's it like when I exercise, which is really different than, I think of it as shoulding. I should exercise, right? There's this joke, we should all over ourselves, you know, because we get in this habit of, oh, you know, we have this thought, I should exercise. And then we force ourselves to exercise, which actually isn't very rewarding. And so that process, you know, this is the New Year's resolution failure syndrome, if you want to think of it that way. That process is doomed to fail because we're doing it because we think we should, as compared to doing something because it's rewarding in itself. And so here, you know, there's so many habits that we can tap into where we notice how rewarding they actually feel. So for example, if we want to break the habit of social media or being on our phone all the time, we can pay attention to what it's like when we're on our phone all the time versus having a really good conversation with somebody. When we feel connected with people, it feels good. So that in itself, we can just remember, oh, what's it like when I actually had a good conversation and I wasn't, distracted by my phone? It feels so much better than when we're totally distracted by our phones.
Yeah, great examples. Great examples. So, Chris, let's look at what questions we have. Maybe we can probably have time for one or two before we close.
Sure. Yeah, let's take a look. There is a lot out there. One is someone was asking about what are some specific tips for how coaches can help their clients to break habits and replace them?
That's a great question. I would not do it service by just giving you little snippets, but I can give you a pointer to some free resources where you can actually learn this. Because I've gotten that question so many times, I actually put together a 7-part short video series that's free on my website especially for healthcare providers, but this could be for anybody that's trying to break a habit, around learning how habits are formed, what the mindfulness evidence is, and even things like developing resilience, working with burnout, and overcoming tech addiction, I think is the last one. So it's just, my website's drjud.com, drjud.com, and then in there's a courses tab at the top, and there's only one course that's that anybody can take for free. And if you're a physician, you can actually get continuing medical education credits through Brown University. So I'm going to refer you to that resource rather than do it a disservice by skipping through it, because it's not as simple as like, here's a 3-step process and it's guaranteed to work. It's really about understanding how the mind works and then how to apply mindfulness to it, which is why we've put together this series of trainings for it.
Great, thank you. Do we have time for any more, Allison, or?
How about we just one more, and then we'll start to close out.
Okay. Okay, one second. How about, someone was asking about, you know what, let me read this one to you. I've read that addictions come in bundles. In other words, we usually have more than one addiction. Are there certain addictions that seem to go hand in hand that result in breaking them becomes more difficult? Or is having more addictions helpful in terms of mapping them in order to better see what's going on and then create the new map to receiving rewards?
Yeah, I tend to think of the latter. So there are some, and because I have an addiction clinic, I'm a little biased in that direction. So I often see people who smoke and then drink or use drugs or whatnot. So that's the one that I've seen most. But I think the latter, as this person described very nicely, is that the more we have, the more we actually have an opportunity to learn how our mind works. And the nice thing is that we don't have to apply a different solution to each of these, because it's the same learning process. We can unlearn each of these in the same way. I'll give a concrete example. I saw a patient who was referred for severe anxiety, and he had classic panic where he couldn't drive on the highway and all this stuff. And I gave him our Unwinding Anxiety program, and he came back 2 weeks later and he said, I've lost 10 pounds. I said, yeah, he was overweight. And I said, we're working on anxiety. He said, yeah, I realized I eat to manage my anxiety. He came back a month later, he had lost another 20 pounds. And he's like, I'm noticing all these other habit loops. And he was starting, the panic was really entrenched. So he was making some progress with that. But in the meantime, all these other habits seemed so easy for him that he's like, oh yeah, I just don't eat like that anymore because I realized it's just not rewarding. And so it's that bundle for him that helped him start to not only change these other habits, but give him the confidence to be able to work with his big one, which was his panic and his anxiety.
That's so great.